Now, let's kind of see all this work in action. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to right click on my table again. I'm going to say show table data. What this is going to do is provide me a way to just key in some student data. So I'm going to type in Kevin Gantos 1 2 3 4 5. I'm essentially moving my data from my home controller into my database table. Apparently identity is not set to true on my table, so I'm going to hit escape here. I'm going to right click on my table again, and I'm going to open the table definition, which will bring me the designer. I'm going to click on ID. I'm going to go to my properties dialog, and then I want to go under identity specification, and then where it says is identity, I want to say true. So my ID field becomes the identity. So basically that means that ID will auto number. Hit update to generate an update script. It will update my table. I can go ahead and close out my table now. I can do a refresh. And now my ID field is not mutable. I can't make changes to it. So now I can say Kevin Gantos 1 2 3 4 5, and it'll automatically set the ID to 1. So we now have one record. So inside of my controller, my home controller, under my Hello World action, I currently have a line of code that creates a student object and passes it to the view. If I F5 and load up this controller and action, this is my home index, so I'm going to go to home/hello world. And it comes back with hello world, first name Kevin, last name Gantos, student ID 1 2 3 4 5. These are values that are coming straight from my controller's code. What I want to do though is I want to pull that data from the database. So I'll stop my debugger. This will become my variable. And what I want to do is I want to pull that data from the database, but I don't want to hit the DB context directly. Now you may be thinking, why? Why wouldn't you want to pull from the context directly? Well, pulling from the context tightly couples our application to that database. And what we really want to accomplish is we want to have a level of decoupling or de-integration. We want to make our application more flexible. So to do that, we're going to use the repository method, and this method basically says that between your data access layer and your actual controller, there should be a repository class that facilitates pulling and pushing data into your data store. So if we end up not using SQL Server and the Entity Framework at some point, and we decide that we want to instead use a series of web services, we don't change the repository interfaces or methods. Instead, we change the implementation of those methods to make them hit a web service. The controller and the code that the controller uses doesn't change because the repository definition itself does not change. The classes do not change. Our student class doesn't change. But the code inside of that repository can be completely rewritten and facilitate us to connect to a web service, or maybe we store things in a XML document, or maybe we just write them to disk. Whatever we would want to do, we can facilitate doing that by making adjustments to the repository itself. So I've gone ahead and created a student repository class, and I kind of just stubbed this out before the lecture. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say week for DB context, and I'm just going to create a private variable called context. I'm going to say this is a new week for DB context. Then inside of each one of these methods, I'm going to use that context to either get, add, update, or delete student data. So from context, I have a students property, and I can return a collection of students, and students itself represents every record in the student table. So by just calling context.students, I'm going to get all students. So if there was more than one student record in the student table, let's say there was 2 or 3 or 5, get all students would give me every student in that table. get student by ID, I can say return context.students, and then I have a series of action methods. If you remember from our lecture last week on link, you'll notice some of these are very similar. We have things like select and where, and there's some additional methods that are of value, such as single or first or find. And these methods allow us to go through and actually seek through or basically generate SQL statements to pull data from that particular DB context or table, in this case students. Now we can write this as a link statement using our lambda expression. So we can say student dot find, and what this is looking for is key values, or our primary key records in that table. Now this is searching on student ID, so using find will not work because the student ID is a string field, which is not a primary key field. There is a primary key called ID, so we'll end up with a key conflict when we try to search on find. But we can say where, and then here's our lambda expression. So we're going to then write a lambda expression where we're going to be receiving a student. So basically we're doing a logical check for every student. So we'll say where the student ID equals the student ID parameter that was passed in. And then what we want is we want first or default. And first or default will basically say grab the first matching record that's returned from the where statement, or the default, which is null, if there are no matching records. So this student ID here is this parameter. This student ID is the property off of the student object that's being evaluated. So this is a nice shorthand way of doing our where statement. We could also do this as return. And we could say from s, or stu, in context.students, where stu.studentID equals student ID, select stu, first or default. So that's another way we could do it using link. But personally, I find this syntax to be a little easier to read. Either one is valid. There's no performance gain from one versus the other. Basically, this latter syntax with link gets converted into this lambda expression set by the compiler. So you ultimately end up running this code even though you're writing your statements using link. Add, very similar. What we can basically say is context.students. There's an add method which takes a student entity, and we can take this template variable that's being passed as a parameter. This should be our student template for creating our student, and we'll pass that into add, and then we'll say var new student. And what add will do is it will add the template to the DB set, which basically means to you and I is it does an insert statement into the student table using the data from the template, and then it's going to return us a new student, which is basically that same record with an ID field. And then what we'll do is we'll return new student. So we'll get back that same student, but they'll now have a primary key. We can say context.students dot, and now that you would think naturally we would do update, but there is no update method. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say context.students.find, and what we can do here is we can do a find, so we can say where student.id, and then this will be the DB student, or the student from the database, and then we can copy properties between the objects. And that would look something like db student.studentID equals student.studentID. We'd have to do that for each one of these. Or there is a shorthand that works sometimes and doesn't work sometimes. So you have to kind of do some trial and error and some testing. For very simple DTOs or data transfer objects, student being one of our DTOs, you can use this syntax. Other times you'll have to go through the logistics of actually copying property at a time data from your parameter into your database student instance. So to do an update for a simple DTO, you can say context dot entry, and then you pass it an entity. In this case, it's student. And then you can say state equals modified. And then you can say context.save changes. And we actually need this save changes here as well. And what save changes does for us is it will actually go through and performs the commit to the database. Now, context entry student.state, what we're saying here is take our DB context, find the entry for this student. So it does a lookup on the ID, and then we're saying take this student object, this entry, and set its state as modified, telling Entity Framework that there's a change that needs to be saved. Then perform that save. Now the delete is very much like the add, so we'll simply say context.students.remove student context.save changes. So this is a simple repository implementation for our students. So again, we're not hitting the DB context directly, because now we have some flexibility where if we need to make changes to this implementation, we can make those modifications, and we still have the flexibility of swapping out this DB context for another context, for a different method of retrieval and submission of student data. But we know that we'll always have these 5 methods, and we'll always be either returning or consuming a student object. So back to our home controller, we'll now say stu equals, and then we'll need an instance of our student repository. So we'll say equals new student repository. So stu will be equal to new, or to student repo.get all students. And then from here, since this is an IEnumerable, we still have access to some of those lambda expressions. So we can go ahead and say first or default. So what this really means to you and I is student repository, go get all the students out of the student table, and then just give us the one off the top. Currently there's only one record, so that will just get us by nature that record. So we can then take that student and load it into our view. So F6, everything compiles, F5 to run. Go ahead and get rid of that extra tab. So we're now in our application. We can say home/hello world, and we're getting a compiler error. Additional information: the connection string weak for DB context in the application's config does not contain the required provider name attribute. So one piece that we missed in setting up our web config was the provider. So there's a third component here that we can provide, which is the provider name. And when you're connecting to SQL Server, it's system.data.sql client. So we'll set that. We'll F5 again, relaunch. Gonna kind of sneak in here and say home/hello world. And we have an error that was not handled by our user code. We'll go ahead and hit OK to that and continue. And it says object reference is not set to an instance of the object. So let's go ahead and do a little bit of debugging. So we'll put a breakpoint here on line 37. I'm going to refresh. So student repo exists, get all students, and then we have first or default. So stu is currently null. I'm going to do a step over on this line and see what stu is still null. Interesting. So if we mouse over get all students, and let's do a add watch, we'll see that we receive back a select statement. So what's happening is when we call get all students, we're actually receiving what's called a iQueryable, and that iQueryable contains the select statement. Now, something you'll notice in the select statement that's generated by the entity framework is that it's doing a select ID, first name, last name, student ID, from dbo.students. So it's looking for a table with a plural students. What we need to do to resolve that is we'll accept that error, we'll hit stop, is we're actually going to go back into our student class. And there are certain attributes, and if you've never dealt with attributes, they're very useful within the entity framework and MVC. We're going to do a square bracket above our class name, and then we're going to say table, and then parentheses. We're going to put in a string student. Now we get a compile time red line. There is a resolve that we need to do, that we need a using statement to go to system.componentModel.dataAnnotations.schema. That will then include the table attribute. We'll F6 to recompile, F5 to redeploy, and we'll actually get our data back from the database. Now, just to show that this is coming from the database, I'm going to go into my Server Explorer, my student table. I'm going to do show table data. This will bring me into my table data, and I can actually manipulate this. So we can say, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we can say 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. So I'm making that change to the database only. I'm going to go ahead and refresh. And by doing that refresh, we'll then refetch data from the database and present it in our view. So what's happening is our repo is going and fetching that data, giving us back the student object. That student object contains the data from the student table, and everything is presented. So by doing that and then adding our our table attribute with the student table name, so the student represents the name of this table. By adding that, we then have all the appropriate mappings and connections to enable our application to work using the entity framework and local DB. This will be the basic model for all of your applications moving forward. The use of local DB as your database, the use of entity framework as your conduit, and then creating repository classes to facilitate pushing and pulling data from your data store in your application.